Perhaps the most defining characteristic of the political left is an opposition to hierarchy. The further left, the more opposed to hierarchy. The further right, the more supportive of hierarchy. One's attitude towards hierarchy is a large part of what defines one's position on the political spectrum. Leftists do not all completely oppose hierarchy, but they do exhibit a general hostility to many modern hierarchies. The hierarchies associated with race, class, gender, sexuality, and government being some major examples. Given the centrality of hierarchy to left-wing politics, we would be wise to consider it. What is hierarchy? And is it something we should seek to abolish? Those are the questions I wish to ponder today. For starters, what is hierarchy? Hierarchy describes a system characterized by various ranks, which hold different levels of authority. Hierarchy describes a system, a social order in which some have greater authority than others. In a hierarchical system, some people have greater power than others. That is what hierarchy is. Modern society is saturated with countless different hierarchies. Examples of hierarchy are incredibly diverse. An extreme form of hierarchy is the relationship between a slave and a master. The master has far more power than the slave and has massive power over the slave. But not all forms of hierarchy are this extreme. A doctor has greater authority than a regular person when it comes to medical matters. This is also a form of hierarchy. Hierarchy is an incredibly nuanced thing. Should we leftists seek to abolish hierarchy? Should we consider hierarchy to be our enemy? The first notable point is of course the fact that abolishing hierarchy is arguably impossible. People will never be completely equal in how much power they hold. Some people will always hold more power than others. Some people will always hold some power over others. Even if everyone was somehow given an identical amount of power, some people are going to wield it far more effectively than others. Therefore, they will have greater power than them and a higher position in the hierarchy. But we can act to minimize hierarchy. Many bad things can't be abolished outright. That doesn't mean we should stop trying to minimize them. But is hierarchy a bad thing? I don't think that it is. I think that it is very often bad, but I don't think it is inherently bad, and I am going to explain why. I will give one example of hierarchy having the capacity to be good. As a general rule, professionals should, within the bounds of their field, have more power than non-professionals. To give an example, structural engineers should have authority over the design of a bridge. What they say should be taken far more seriously than what someone uneducated on the matter says. Is this a form of hierarchy? I think it absolutely is. Concerning the matter of bridge design, the structural engineers have more power than the average person. They have power over the average person in the sense that what they say is far more important than what an average person says. I think this is a form of hierarchy, albeit a far more tame and defensible one than the ones often fixated on within the political realm. There are countless such hierarchies. Medical professionals are another example. Doctors have greater authority over medical matters than the average person, and so they should. This is a form of hierarchy, and it is a form of good hierarchy. It is often good for professionals to have greater authority than regular people. There are two simple premises. Firstly, that these are hierarchies, and secondly, that these are desirable. I think that it is inarguable that these hierarchies of professionalism are hierarchies. They are systems and structures in which some have greater authority than others. That authority may be limited to a specific field and restricted in what it can do, but it is a form of authority nonetheless. It is a hierarchy. It is a social structure in which some have considerably greater authority than others. Is this a good thing? I certainly think so. I would prefer that the bridges I drive over be constructed by structural engineers rather than random people. I would prefer that the medicines I take be created and tested by doctors and scientists rather than some random person messing around with a chemistry set. I would prefer that the house I live in be created by skilled and educated tradesmen rather than some random guy with a hammer and a few nails. I would prefer that the plane I fly in be flown by a professional pilot rather than some random passenger. These are hierarchical things that I desire. And not just me, but anyone who has even a semblance of rationality. Even the most basic primal desire for self-preservation leads one to these preferences. These things are hierarchical because they describe a social order in which some people have greater authority than me within a specific area. The hierarchy of professionalism is very often a good thing. If we accept that these hierarchies of professionalism are firstly hierarchies and secondly desirable, then hierarchy clearly isn't inherently bad. If we accept these two premises, hierarchy clearly isn't something that we should move to abolish. We should move to abolish some hierarchies, but not all hierarchies. Hierarchies are often bad, but they aren't inherently bad. I think that these examples make that very obvious. There is something to be said about the nuances of the distinction between having more power than others and having power over others. But ultimately, both having more power than others and having power over others are characteristics of hierarchy. Regardless of nuances, the presence of one of these things means that a hierarchy is present, and arguably these things necessarily coexist. And hierarchy doesn't have to be massive. It can be incredibly small, and it is deeply nuanced. One can be above someone on one hierarchy and below them on another. Let us continue pondering the extent to which hierarchy is necessary and the desirability of its abolition. It is now that I come to the core idea of this particular piece, the paradox of hierarchy. The paradox is that if you want to minimize hierarchy, you actually need some degree of hierarchy. Allow me to elaborate. A society with no hierarchy would have no police, no prison, no law, and no government. Every single one of these institutions is predicated on some people having greater power than others, and some people having power over others. While such institutions often represent some of the worst excesses of unjust hierarchy, this should not lead one to underestimate their potential value in the fight against unjust hierarchy. Without such institutions, there is nothing to keep people in line. Without artificial rationality and state violence to keep them in check, the amoral would be free to pursue whatever they like, however they like. Very often they would pursue power over others. How do I know? Because for all of human history, some people have enjoyed trying to gain power over others. I don't think these people will magically vanish anytime soon. With nothing to stop them, their pursuits would often be successful. And the pursuit of power has a necessary outcome: the creation of hierarchy. Great hierarchy at that. If we abolished laws, police, prisons, and government, as we must if we want to abolish hierarchy, those who are strong, ambitious, and amoral will necessarily be empowered. Their attempt to increase their power will lead to one of two consequences. The government, police, law, and prisons will be re-established in some form by the populace in an attempt to save themselves from the ensuing horrors. Or alternatively, the strong, ambitious, and amoral will succeed, in which case massive unjust hierarchies emerge, with the public being brutalized at will, and the society being divided into territories occupied by vicious warlords. So long as some people are amoral and power-hungry, we will need institutions to keep them under control. These institutions very often rely on hierarchy. In other words, minimizing hierarchy necessitates some degree of hierarchy, because it is only through hierarchy that we can keep ourselves in check. Do away with hierarchy, and the beast will be uncaged. But at what cost? Lawlessness is the freedom to brutalize, and the freedom to be brutalized. It is the harshest and most reprehensible of freedoms. The abolition of hierarchy will unchain every monster out there. In abolishing one hierarchy, the groundwork is laid for a worse one. We will never remove every factor that can lead to amoral, power-hungry actions. We need systems in place to address such actions, and those systems are fundamentally hierarchical. Without any hierarchy, there is nothing to keep people from establishing worse hierarchies. How are we to keep people from establishing hierarchies without our own hierarchies to keep them in line? Without just hierarchies, how can we prevent the emergence of unjust hierarchies? Without law, government, police, and prisons, how do we prevent the emergence of the worst hierarchies? Be it the hierarchy at play between a terrible criminal and a victim, or the hierarchy at play between a warlord and those he rules over. I don't want to rely on people being kind and rational. I don't want the well-being of people to be completely reliant on everyone being a good, rational person. We need a system that can address the reality that some people do bad, irrational things. We need a system that can address the reality that people are not reliably rational and good. Without such a system, we condemn ourselves to existence beneath a far worse hierarchy. By all means, abolish these institutions. Abolish law, the police, and the prisons for the sake of freedom. I am sure the murdered and raped will feel so very free. I am sure that those who reside under the boot of warlords will have immense liberty. I am sure that the many who will be brutalized and butchered at the hands of lawlessness will appreciate the removal of their chains. Without a hierarchy to keep people in check, the worst kinds of hierarchy begin to emerge. A depraved, chaotic, amoral hierarchy. This is the paradox of hierarchy. If we want to minimize hierarchy, some degree of hierarchy is an absolute necessity. Not all forms of hierarchy are unjust and undesirable. One of the greatest tools available for the opponents of unjust hierarchy is just hierarchy. Hierarchy is very often evil, but hierarchy is not inherently evil. One would be wise to remember that. The left suffers from few ailments more than a lack of nuance. As is often the case with political discussion, much disagreement on this issue comes down to the use of differing definitions. It is always worth keeping that in mind.